In our headlines at this hour, inflation accelerated to almost a 24-year high here in South Korea to hit 6% on year in June amid the repercussions of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Authorities are addressing South Korea's efforts to ease its carbon footprints by expanding nuclear energy initiatives and reducing coal fuel imports. A 22-year-old gunman opened fire from a rooftop in a Chicago suburb during a 4th of July parade, killing several people and injuring dozens. Hello, you're watching the Daily Report. It's Tuesday afternoon, July 5th, here in capital Seoul. South Korea's inflation shot up to 6% in June, the highest since 1998, largely in light of external factors which pundits believe will further push up consumer prices. Our Shin Se-byuk starts us off.
South Korea's consumer prices rose at the fastest pace in almost 24 years in June due to the high energy and food costs. Data from Statistics Korea on Tuesday shows consumer prices soared 6% from the same month last year. That is the largest jump since November 1998 during the Asian financial crisis. The June figure marks the 15th consecutive month that the index has risen by more than 2%, which is the central bank's inflation target over the medium term. The rapid surge comes on the back of soaring energy, food, and raw materials prices. By category, livestock prices shot up 10.3% on year, with imported beef rising by around 27% and chicken and pork up by around 20%. The cost of insurance was up almost 15%, rent climbed almost 3%, and the cost of dining out jumped 8%. Petroleum product prices saw an average of almost 40% increase, with gasoline jumping 50% and diesel and LPG rising around 30%. To ease the burden of high energy prices, the government is rolling out several measures, including cutting the fuel tax to the legal cap of 37%. But the latest hikes in electricity rates and natural gas prices are feared to lead to further inflation. So what can the government do to put a cap on prices?
It can limit wage increases, which can further increase prices through wage price spiral, and we can try to keep the expected inflation, expectations of future inflation low, so that when the oil prices and grain prices come back down, as it eventually must, then it'll be easier to control the inflation then when grain and oil prices come down.
Due to geopolitical uncertainties, Statistics Korea said consumer price increases are at a high risk of reaching even 7 or 8%, and that annual inflation could exceed the 4.7% forecast by the Finance Ministry. To tame mounting inflationary pressure, some experts even predict that the Bank of Korea might raise interest rates by a big step of 50 basis points this month. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
And against that backdrop, S&P Global Ratings believes South Korea's annual inflation will reach 5% this year in response to soaring global energy expenses and commodity costs. Our Lee Kyung-won explains.
S&P Global Ratings released its inflation outlook for Asia-Pacific region for this year on Monday, with South Korea at 5%, the same as New Zealand and Singapore. The outlook for India is the region's highest at 6.8%, while the forecast for Hong Kong is lowest at 2.1%. S&P says higher energy and commodity prices are raising inflation in major economies in the region, and that's prompting central banks in those countries to normalize monetary policies to bring prices under control. However, S&P also said the region has only recently faced inflation pressure, as consumer prices have not yet risen as high as in European countries. It added that other than China hit hard by COVID-19 lockdowns, the growth outlook for the Asia-Pacific economy seems rather optimistic. And although exports may have taken a hit recently, the region is currently on course to fully recover from the pandemic. Based on those projections, S&P sees South Korea's inflation dropping to 2.4% in 2023, followed by 1.8% in 2024, before dropping to 1.6% in 2025. It also suggests that Asia's fourth largest economy will expand 2.6% on year in 2022. That's 0.1 percentage point higher than its previous estimate released in April. Meanwhile, South Korea's Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho recently projected a rate of 6% inflation for the June to August period. 이경은, Arirang News.
President Yoon Suk-yeol has also made note of the country's rapid rise in inflation, pointing to disruptions in supply chains as being part of the broader cause behind skyrocketing consumer prices. At a cabinet meeting Tuesday, Yoon reiterated his intentions to place priority on easing the cost of living by presiding over a weekly emergency economy meeting and heeding public woes. Now, he also pledged to seek tangible cuts in government spending to allow for more financial aid to those in need. The government has been lowering tariffs and fuel taxes in a bid to tame inflation. And despite efforts by the government to address the cost of living, the impact of inflation itself is weighing heavily on the people. Our Ian Jin covers the public sentiment.
The economic hardship brought by inflation is hitting people from all walks of life. This restaurant owner has been running his business for 25 years. But the price of ingredients is becoming harder to handle. His regulars have helped him push through the past couple of years of hardship, but now prices have risen more than 30% from last year.
The price of cooking oil, for instance, has tripled. I've never seen this kind of inflation in my 25 years of business.
And the increased cost of ingredients is starting to be reflected in the prices that customers have to pay too.
I've seen a lot of places where stickers with new prices have been put on the menu. A quick run to the grocery store costs more than 50,000 won.
Hit more directly by the soaring gas prices are taxi drivers. Even LPG, which had been relatively inexpensive, has exceeded 1,100 won. That's roughly 85 cents. Yet taxi fares haven't changed.
1/3 of a day's income goes out in fuel costs. The cost of living is going up and income is decreasing. Times are difficult.
Small and medium-sized companies that support the South Korean economy are all affected by high inflation, high interest rates, and high exchange rates. High global energy costs have brought on the latest hike in electricity rates here in South Korea that will go into effect for electricity bills this month. The people are feeling more pain as there seems to be no end in sight for the rising prices. 이은진, Arirang News.
South Korea's foreign exchange reserves dropped for a fourth month in a row last month, recording their biggest fall since 2008 global financial crisis. According to the Bank of Korea Tuesday, foreign exchange reserves, a barometer of financial stability, stood at around $438 billion. Now that's down about $9.4 billion compared to the month of May. The BOK has linked the drop to the stronger dollar affecting non-dollar assets and a fall in deposits at financial institutions as some assets were sold to stabilize the volatile exchange rate. Around 90% of South Korea's FX reserves are securities, and as of the end of May, South Korea's reserves were the 9th largest in the world. China reportedly has the largest reserves, followed by neighboring Japan. Also on this Tuesday, the Yoon administration unveiled its energy policy direction. The gist is to address climate change and to ensure energy security, as well as to advance related technology. During talks with relevant officials, President Yoon Suk-yeol also reaffirmed that his commitment to nuclear energy initiatives, with the hope of having nuclear power account for about 30% of the country's energy needs by the year 2030, up from some 27% last year. The government is also aiming to reduce the country's dependence on fossil fuel imports with a more feasible mix, that is, of nuclear, renewable and hydrogen energy. In Ukraine, some $750 billion will be needed to rebuild the country's infrastructure amid Russia's destructive campaign. Our Kim Yo-san has more on the estimated expenses for reconstruction efforts there.
$750 billion is what Ukraine estimates will be needed for the country's recovery in the wake of Russia's invasion. Addressing major international leaders during a two-day Ukraine recovery conference in Switzerland, the Ukrainian Prime Minister explained that the direct damage to their country's infrastructure totals over $100 billion.
Today, the direct infrastructure losses of Ukraine stand at over $100 billion. More than 1,200 educational institutions, more than 200 hospitals, thousands of kilometres of gas pipelines, water and electricity networks, roads and railway tracks were destroyed or damaged.
He then added that a three-stage recovery plan is needed. This, he says, involves immediate recovery of what is critical for people's lives, fast recovery, as well as a long-term transformation. He also highlighted that the key source of recovery should be the confiscated assets of Russia and its oligarchs, adding they should be responsible for the war that they have unleashed. Against this backdrop, Ukrainian forces were taking up new defensive lines in the eastern part of the country. This comes as Russian President Vladimir Putin hailed Moscow's victory after months of battles fought over Luhansk. During a televised meeting, Putin congratulated the country's forces on what he described as the, quote, victories in the Luhansk region. The battle is seen as the closest Russia has come to achieving one of its objectives since its forces were defeated trying to capture Ukraine's capital city in March. Kim Hye-sun, Arirang News.
Over in the U.S., a 22-year-old man is in custody in connection to a deadly shooting at a 4th of July parade in a Chicago suburb. According to local authorities, the man, Robert Crimo, is being questioned for opening fire on the parade that would be, from a rooftop shortly after celebrations began early Monday, with participants apparently being targeted at random. At least 6 people were killed and dozens were injured. On that note, we end part 1 of the Daily Report. We return with part 2 in a few minutes. Stay with us.
What matters?
Welcome back. President Yoon Suk-yeol partook in 16 diplomatic engagements during his 3 official days in Spain for the NATO summit. On Viewpoint today, we have a panel of foreign journalists and their take on his debut on the international stage. I have Andres Sanchez-Brown, correspondent for EFE Spain, here in the studio. Andres, welcome back.
Thank you for having us here, as always.
I also have Frank Smith with Deutsche Welle live on the line. Frank, it's good to have you with us as well.
Good to be back and see you, Sunny and Andres.
Right, Andres, we'll start here in the studio then. This year's NATO summit included leaders from the Asia-Pacific region. How was this unprecedented event, if I may, covered by the Spanish media, Andres?
Well, as you pointed out, it was the first time that these 4 countries, that is Korea, New Zealand, Japan, and Australia, were present at a NATO summit as associated countries. The extended summit that these 4 countries had was covered by Spanish media, and it was regarded as, let's say, a pledge to solidify support for NATO from these 4 countries, of course. But it was also read, let's say, the other way around, because this was, you know, we can call it a historic NATO summit, not only because the summit itself seemed to have revitalized an organization that was not going through its best time just a couple of years ago. It has also solidified, let's say, opposition towards Russia. But for the first time, I think, what it has done, it has placed NATO, which is a US-led organization, but let's not forget that mostly comprised by European countries. This summit has placed NATO for the first time, I would say, at the forefront of Washington's power struggle with Beijing. And this, for many European countries, is not only new, but a little bit unsettling also, because to many of these European countries and the EU itself, China is their biggest trading partner. So this would mark, let's say, the start of the end of this European ambiguity towards China, probably. And it also actually puts many of these European countries, for the first time, in the shoes of countries like Korea, which has a very important trading relationship. China is the biggest trading partner for South Korea, but South Korea also has, in the United States, its biggest military ally. So I think that that was worth noting, and I think Spanish media did report on that quite extensively, actually.
Right, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But first then, Frank, President Yoon Suk-yeol, like I mentioned earlier, had a very busy agenda in Spain, to say the least. What do you suppose, Frank, was behind this perhaps hectic schedule?
Well, I think a big part of this was positioning South Korea on the world stage. We have a new leader here, of course, Yoon Suk-yeol, and he wants to kind of state South Korea's orientation to the world. This was the first time that a South Korean president had attended a NATO summit. He wants to establish a mission to NATO in Brussels and sign a cooperation agreement between South Korea and NATO. So again, it's positioning and outlining South Korea's position on the world stage. Moving forward, we're likely to see Yoon Suk-yeol participate more in the international community. He also sought a response from NATO and from South Korea's allies around the world, a response to North Korea's recent provocations with, rumors suggesting North Korea might conduct a nuclear test. Certainly, the Yoon administration wants to gather as much sort of alliance support to push back against that kind of thing. It's also was something of a sales, trip to promote South Korea's weapons internationally, and also South Korea's nuclear power plants, in addition, of course, to the mainstay of South Korea's exports, electronics. So multiple sort of levels of initiatives from the South Korean president to attend this NATO summit. Sunny?
Right, and staying with those multiple levels, then let's focus now then on the diplomatic efforts. Andres, addressing members of the NATO summit, President Yoon Suk-yeol warned of threats to universal values, while during his trilateral talks with his US and Japanese counterparts, he highlighted the importance, of course, of a unified and firm front against North Korea's provocations. How, Andres, would you assess his debut on the multilateral diplomatic stage?
Well, I think his debut, it was actually his debut, as we know, was pretty much in line with, I believe, what were his pledges during campaigning when it comes to foreign policy. As Frank just pointed out, and you just pointed out, during the trilateral summit between Korea, Japan, and the U.S., of course, the North Korean issue was brought to the forefront. It was underlined once again that North Korea seems to be ready to conduct its seventh nuclear test and the danger that that implies. But also, I think it's important to note that for, I would say, another 4 reasons I could point out. Well, North Korea would be one. And North Korea was actually brought up also in, I believe, almost every bilateral that he had, in every single one of them, actually. The countries, the leaders that met with Yoon actually showed their support for President Yoon's, compromise to achieve denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula. That would be one. And also President Yoon making a harder stance on what needs to be done when it comes to responding to North Korea. The second thing would be, as you mentioned, talking about shared values. He talked a lot about the importance of the rule of law and how Korea and all these countries, these NATO countries and associated countries, actually do share these values. And how important it is at a time like this, when on different degrees, but mostly, I would say, in every single one of these countries, these values are compromised right now. I can't think of a better way when it comes to defending these assets than aligning and associating. The third thing I would say was Yoon once again stressed, like he did during his campaign, that Korea has grown economically, culturally. It is a big player in so many aspects in the world now, and it needs to up its game also at the international level and engage the country with the international community on a bigger level. And I think this message was actually received on the other side, especially from European countries, and it was very well received because, when you talk to European diplomats many times, they do point out that many times it is a bit of a struggle to engage with Korea because of how much Korea, how much resources Korea puts on, we could call it a Northeastern Asian / United States axis. It is engaged basically with the United States, North Korea, China, and Japan on such strong levels that there's little other room for engagement. So I think that this message from President Yoon was very, very well received by European countries. The fourth and final one, I'll be finished, was that on his way back, he actually did point out that he enjoyed being able to briefly meet, if you could call it that, with Prime Minister Kishida Fumio from Japan. He held the trilateral summit with President Biden too, and then the quadrilateral one with Australia and New Zealand as well. And he pointed out how important it is to be able to address what he calls past issues and future issues within the same conversation in order to move forward. So these are 4 things that I think point out that all that he said during this summit was pretty much on par with what he had talked about during his campaigning. Definitely.
Right. Frank, pundits say President Yoon's presence at the NATO summit itself stands as indication perhaps of his support of NATO's new strategy with regard to Russia and China. How does this stance then look to affect the Yoon administration's ties with China, do you think?
Well, I think relations between South Korea and China are headed for a bumpy road. After all, Yoon Suk-yeol really campaigned and has so far in administration pursued the reorientation of South Korean foreign policy and foreign relations toward the United States. That's going to rub China the wrong way. We've already seen sort of murmurs of that. China will be on board, for example, I think, more or less with South Korea's pushback against North Korea in terms of its provocations, missile launches, and if it does conduct a nuclear test. After all, there have been reports that China actually has been pressuring North Korea not to conduct another nuclear test, and there's likely going to be a dilemma for China and perhaps even Russia at the UN Security Council. If North Korea conducts another nuclear test, will they continue to sort of support resistance at the Council, and will they support and block another resolution against North Korea should Pyongyang conduct another test? The question will be, again, if Yoon Suk-yeol, how far down this road in terms of developing a U.S.-Japan alliance does he go? Does it include, for example, another thing he floated during the campaign was the deployment of another THAAD battery for the Seoul area, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. That's an American anti-ballistic missile system in South Korea that really kind of offended China. We saw economic sort of repercussions when the first THAAD battery was deployed back in, I think, 2016, 2017. So if Yoon pursues, again, this security alliance, another deployment of THAAD, perhaps large-scale military drills, certainly that's going to offend China further. Also, South Korea has already started and perhaps will more pursue the diversification of its foreign trade, so it's less kind of dependent on its trade relationship with China moving forward. But certainly relations with China, I think, are headed for a bit of turbulence here. Sunhee?
Right. Andres, beyond security then, included in President Yoon's Madrid agenda was a lunch-on meeting with Spanish business leaders. What can you tell us about that encounter and its broader implications?
Well, actually, Spanish business leaders highly appreciated the fact that President Yoon set up time apart to meet them, because apparently he was the only foreign leader that actually did this. During the meeting, President Yoon actually shared his concerns over high inflation or issues concerning the supply chains. And he was met there by Vice Minister of Commerce, Spanish Vice Minister of Commerce, Xiana Mendes, who was here actually in Korea in 2019 when the King and Queen of Spain visited the country. She underlined actually the fact that Korea is Spain's third largest trade partner in the region after China and Japan, that is, and how there's actually apparently a lot of room for growth in that respect. But I would say that the most important part of this meeting was the fact that President Yoon actually got to see with his own eyes what some of the structural, some of the investment plans for these Spanish companies look like in Korea for the coming years. We're talking about companies, for example, related to clean energies or auto parts. And I think the fact that the president got to see this, got a grasp on what Korea means for Spanish companies on the investment field was actually a very, very positive thing for these business leaders, definitely.
Right. Frank, President Yoon also met with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on the sidelines of the NATO summit. What can you share with us about this particular exchange?
Well, the primary part of this meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau and President Yoon Suk-yeol focused on kind of welcoming these Asian Pacific countries, New Zealand, Australia, and Japan, and of course South Korea, into some type of closer relationship with NATO. Also, they talked about Canadian support for Yoon Suk-yeol's sort of more hardline on North Korea's provocation and potential nuclear tests, and also discussed the desire to deepen the two countries' economic and trade relationship. Also, for me, something that resonated was the Prime Minister and Yoon Suk-yeol talking about the Canadian sacrifice here during the Korean War. Just in the past week, I covered this issue down in Busan. John Robert Cormier, who served in the Korean War, was buried at the United Nations cemetery down in Busan about 10 days ago. He served right along the DMZ in 1952 and was involved in very fierce fighting. He was injured there, suffering a shrapnel wound, and even after treatment at a MASH unit returned to his battalion to defend the DMZ. And sometimes, Canadians and other foreigners in South Korea, including certainly myself, we forget about the sacrifice made to keep South Korea, a democratic, a liberal, laissez-faire member of the democratic, group of countries. And I was reminded of that during that coverage, which was interesting for me.
Right, Frank, thank you for shedding light on that, of course, then. Andres, like you mentioned then, President Yoon talked about energy with Spanish business people, but he also addressed energy and the environment with his regional counterparts, as well as his European counterparts, of course. And that being said, what were some of the notable exchanges on that particular front?
Well, actually, President Yoon, I believe, held something like 10 bilateral meetings, which sounds extremely tiring for such a short span of time. But regarding those issues, for example, he did meet the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, and he actually conveyed Korea's interest in taking part of, for example, the green hydrogen projects going on in Australia, which seem to be actually pretty big. He also met the Danish Premier, Mette Frederiksen, and they both, let's say, talked about bringing bigger support to what both countries share. It's called a Green Strategic Comprehensive Partnership. And they vowed greater support, for example, when it comes to offshore wind farms in that respect. When it comes to nuclear power, Yoon met with Emmanuel Macron, who is the president of France, a country that, as you know, is one of the biggest players in the world when it comes to nuclear energy. They both vowed to increase support for common projects in, for example, nuclear power security technologies. And then also President Yoon met with his counterparts from the Czech Republic and Poland, for example, where he actually showed Korean businesses' interest in, for example, winning bids when it comes to nuclear power future projects being built in these countries. So in that respect, a lot was actually talked about during these bilaterals.
Right, that is true. Moving forward, Frank, as South Korea seeks to perhaps strengthen its alliances with its democratic partners, North Korea has made heated accusations about US-led efforts to establish perhaps an Asian-style NATO with South Korea and Japan. Is there any truth to these allegations, or do you suppose Pyongyang is simply seeking a pretext for more provocations?
Sure, I think there's truth to that. Certainly the United States and the Yoon administration want to strengthen their alliance and even, participate, South Korea and Japan participate in a trilateral alliance, and certainly North Korea should be concerned about that. I mean, the U.S. Militarily is far superior to probably any country in the world, and certainly North Korea, along with South Korea, is a superior military, certainly technologically, than North Korea. The question is whether the sort of stick is going to encourage North Korea to change course. Under the previous Moon Jae-in administration, a kind of olive branch was extended to North Korea, seeking more engagement to see if North Korea could be encouraged to negotiate toward denuclearization. Now with the Yoon administration, we're going to see a stronger position, a little bit more of the stick, to try to bring North Korea into talks on denuclearization. So far this year, with the missile tests that took place so far, and also potentially a nuclear test, it remains to be seen if we'll see, the desired outcome. But that's the strategy that the Yoon administration is going to pursue here.
Right. And Andres, come this Sunday, this week that is, the Yoon administration marks 2 months in office, and depending on whom you ask, little or much has been achieved. What are your thoughts with regard to the Yoon administration's future path to realizing their pledges, and what are the potential hurdles?
Well, definitely 2 months is a very short span of time to achieve anything in office. But talking about hurdles, I can think that, of course, the Yoon administration is facing a series of global hurdles that basically any international leader is facing now. We can think of inflation, and we saw today that June's inflation in Korea was the highest since November 1998. We're talking about historic levels of increase in prices. There's the fears of recession. There's the war in Ukraine. There's the problems in the supply chains. There's, if you want to, the power struggle between the U.S. and China. On the more particular side, then of course the Yoon administration faces important challenges once again in the real estate market. We know that ways to cap maybe growing inequality in the country too. And unfortunately, I would have to say North Korea, because even though a lot of people don't seem that interested right now in North Korea, including South Koreans, because the country has been unwilling to engage for more than 2 years, that is. Unfortunately, the 7th nuclear test seems ready and on track. And if it does happen, as Frank pointed out, this is going to put the whole region in a very difficult situation. We really don't know what Russia and China's position are going to be after this. And this definitely is going to pose a challenge for the government, which is also facing the fact that North Korea is just building more and more and more very sophisticated, very dangerous weapons.
Right, and that being said, Frank, very briefly speaking, a few words of humble advice from you to the government with regard to navigating this difficult security and economic challenges.
Well, I'd say, South Korea has charted a course quite a few decades ago, couple of generations ago, and I think now with these challenging times, hopefully the country and its leadership will remember its values. Certainly that's something that Yoon Suk-yeol has talked about. At the same time, I'd like to see the political leaders around the world, and especially here in South Korea, exercise a little bit more consensus in terms of executing its foreign policy, rather than go back and forth to different sort of strategies. Try to stay on a sort of charted course over more than just a 4-year presidential term. Sunny?
Right. All right, Frank, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts and your time. And Andres here in the studio, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, and great to see Frank, even though
good to be here and meet with you guys.
Thank you.
Authorities here have announced a dramatic rebound in COVID-19 infections on this Tuesday. A total of 18,147 new cases have been reported, the highest daily tally in 40 days. 2 people lost their lives and over 50 patients remain in critical care. Now, health experts have warned of a resurgence in late summer or early autumn amid waning vaccine immunity and increased public movement. In other news, advances on the business front between South Korea and Japan will serve to enhance diplomatic ties. Now, this is according to President Yoon Suk-yeol on Monday at a related forum here in capital Seoul. Our Jung reports.
Seoul-Tokyo economic ties can serve as the catalyst to restore bilateral relations. That's according to South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, who met with the representatives of the Japan Business Federation, or Keidanren, on Monday and discussed strengthening economic cooperation between the two countries. President Yoon said business representatives from South Korea and Japan holding their first official meeting in 3 years in Seoul could be an important milestone in revitalizing exchanges between the two countries. He added that the business leaders working together as reliable partners has been a pillar of the Seoul-Tokyo relationship and called for continued conversation. Masakatsu Tokura, chief of Keidanren, told President Yoon that both sides confirmed their will to expand economic cooperation and maintain friendly ties. He also expressed hope for high-level diplomatic meetings between the two countries. The Korea-Japan Business Council was convened earlier on Monday by South Korea's Federation of Korean Industries and Japan's Business Federation, which are major business lobby groups of the two nations. The meeting had been held every year since 1983, but was stalled for 3 years due to the pandemic. The two sides discussed removing export curbs and resuming a currency swap between the two nations. They signed a joint statement to improve cooperation and build a better relationship. This comes amid frayed bilateral relations after Tokyo implemented export curbs on Seoul over industrial goods essential to tech industries and amid other historical disputes arising from Japan's colonial rule. 엄지영, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, in line with efforts to seek tangible closure to Japan's wartime atrocities, a South Korean task force has been set up comprising of government officials, academic experts and related attorneys. Our Kim Dami has more.
Diplomatic efforts by Seoul to arrange direct negotiations between the Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor and related parties in Japan to finally resolve the matter. That's what the victims asked for on Monday from the South Korean government at the inaugural session of the Government Civil Society Task Force.
We asked the South Korean government to invoke diplomatic protection as a power recognized by the Supreme Court decision in 2018.
Diplomatic protection is when states act on behalf of their citizens whose rights have been violated by another state. It came up in 2018 when South Korea's top court ordered Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel Corporation to compensate the victims. The Japanese firms refused to pay, citing Japan's official position that all reparations were settled under the 1965 accord that normalized the bilateral ties. This refusal led to the Korean victims filing lawsuits, which they won, to have the company's assets in Korea seized. Led by the first Vice Foreign Minister Do Hyun-dong, Monday's session brought together government officials, experts, as well as the attorneys of the victims and their families. Ahead of Monday's meeting, the attorneys told reporters that the Japanese companies have not responded to communication in any shape or form and stressed that it would be a rational move for the firms to negotiate with the victims. If such talks do take place, they said, the lawsuit to seize their assets could go in another direction if the victims agree. The companies have appealed the original court ruling, so the liquidation of their assets has not yet begun, but the Supreme Court is expected to rule on the appeal in the coming weeks or months. The victim side further warned that the task force should do more than just gather opinions, or they may reconsider their participation. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
And South Korea is seeking a strategic collaboration between its defense and technology ministries to ensure security on all relevant fronts. Our Min Suk-hyun has more on this ambitious blueprint.
South Korea is working to integrate advanced technologies into its defense operations. And in line with that is providing artificial intelligence and software education programs to military officers. At a special event jointly organized by the Ministry of National Defense and the Ministry of Science and ICT, Seoul's defense minister said he hopes this will help the country become a science and technology powerhouse.
We plan to nurture military professionals who will play a leading role in science and technology. It will also be an opportunity for soldiers to receive systematic education for those who will lead a digital future.
The Defense Ministry plans to carry out military AI training for executive officers, while for soldiers, the Science Ministry will provide online-based AI and software courses.
We plan to look for talented people who can play an active role in AI and software sectors. We will support the incredibly talented with follow-up training programs so that they can reach their full potential.
By 2026, the two ministries plan to nurture 1,000 military experts who can improve the country's military capabilities, as well as 50,000 digital specialists who can work in science and technology fields after being discharged from the military. Private IT companies such as Naver, Kakao, and Microsoft have also joined the project to provide business field trips and mentoring services. Min Suk-han, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In Italy, the government has declared a state of emergency as a drought has hit the country. The measure announced on Monday comes as Italy's longest river has seen its lowest water levels in over 70 years. The 650-kilometer-long River Po, which runs across the north of the country, accounts for around one-third of Italy's agricultural production. But due to the low water levels, seawater has begun seeping inland, damaging crops. The emergency declarations have been assigned to 5 regions where the drought is at its worst, while some cities and towns have already implemented water use restrictions. Meanwhile, in central Italy, Rome's Tiber River is becoming increasingly shallow. According to a state-run research body, over the past 30 years, Italy has received only half the average rainfall. U.S. officials looking into a shooting incident in the West Bank in May that killed veteran Al Jazeera reporter Shireen Abu Akleh have said that the bullet that killed her was likely fired by the Israeli military. However, due to the damaged nature of the bullet, the independent third-party examiners were unable to make a full determination. They added that there is, quote, no reason to believe she was targeted. Palestinian officials have since criticized the report, saying she was deliberately targeted. Israel has denied the claims and instead responded that it will continue with its own investigation into the matter. The report comes as the Palestinian-American correspondent was killed while covering an Israeli military raid on May 11th in the occupied West Bank. Rescue operations continue following an avalanche in the Italian Alps on Sunday that killed at least 7 people. Another 8 people were seriously injured and 14 remain unaccounted for. Helicopters and search teams equipped with drones are still looking for the missing climbers but have been hindered by thunderstorms. So far, 3 of the victims have been identified as Italian, whilst authorities work to identify the rest. The disaster comes as high temperatures have caused the Marmolada Glacier, where the avalanche occurred, to shrink in recent years. Competitive eater Joey Chestnut has clinched his 7th consecutive win at Nathan's famous International Hot Dog Eating Contest. The traditional Independence Day event on New York's Coney Island took place on Monday and saw Chestnut consume 63 hot dogs and buns in 10 minutes. Also known as Jaws, he holds 50 world records in eating competitions and has now won this event 15 times in total. Meanwhile, in the women's division, 2020 winner Miki Sudo made a comeback to reclaim her title, eating 40 hot dogs and buns. However, not everyone was happy with the contest, as a protester wearing a Darth Vader mask bumped Chestnut out of position as he was eating his 18th hot dog. But Chestnut managed to pull them to the ground before continuing. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Tuesday afternoon. The capital has been dealing with a heat warning for 3 consecutive days. And as you can see, it's just as hot as yesterday, as a significant back-to-back heat wave is affecting the country. In this weather, you have to be aware of heat-related illnesses, even if you're young and healthy. So please dress in cool, lightweight clothing and drink lots of fluids if you're out and about. And the soaring temperatures are making the air unsettled. Widespread showers are predicted with 5 to 60 millimeters, even up to 80 millimeters of rainfall in some regions, with stormy conditions possible. And now that the typhoon Ari has weakened, all the related advisories in the southern seas have been lifted. While overall the air quality will be good throughout the day, but keep an eye on the high UV index and ozone level. So avoid strenuous activity in the excessive temperatures. And don't forget to put on your sunscreen if you're planning to go out. And monsoon rain returns on Thursday, meaning the extreme heat will subside. The rain will be centered in western regions. Now let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
That ends this edition of the Daily Report. Thank you for watching. See you on Wednesday.